Okay, guys and gals. Yep, I should have done this video a couple of weeks ago, actually. It's from Michael, one of the channel viewers, and he sent me an email. We've been having quite a few conversations over on the YouTube comments, but he did send me an email. I've got a preview of it here. Hi Andy, in the attached file you will find the original RAW, that's what we're looking at here in Lightroom, and an RT 5.8 public release profile. I can't do this in Raw Therapy because I don't have Raw Therapy 5.8, and the PP3 file that Michael sent me isn't compatible properly with the dev build of Raw Therapy that I'm working on. That's why Raw Therapy's taking a bit of time to get released, because they're trying to get the backwards compatibility 100%. But anyway, blah 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 blah. He did send me a Lightroom catalogue, which I could open, but I'm not going to. He's got this RAW file, okay, and he's been having problems with soft proofing and printing, fundamentally because he's using an external print house, all right, and he's elected to put it on some paper that I've actually never heard of. But initially we've got to look at the picture, and here it is, and it's unadulterated, well, very much adulterated by Lightroom glory. As you can see, it's very, very dark, and he shot it on a Panasonic DMC GX80, which I think it's a 16 megapixel sort of, I won't use the word point and shoot, I'll use the word compact. Yeah, I think it's a viewfinder camera or something like that. But anyway, I mean, it's fitted out with a Leica Sumilux lens, so, you know, picture-wise, sharpness-wise, it can't be all that bad. But as you can see, it's massively underexposed, and this is a 4/3 sensor, 16 megapixels, so the the size of the photo sites is absolutely tiny. Yeah, absolutely tiny. And to be quite honest with you, the signal to noise ratio is terrible. So just because the photo sites are that tiny, so any amount of underexposure, you are really going to get a lot of noise showing up in it if you lift that exposure. And the other thing is, when you use a camera that's got such a fundamentally crippled dynamic range because of the poor signal to noise ratio of these tiny photo sites, you do have to be careful. When you've got really good lighting, they work fine. When you get in lighting situations such as Michael's been in here with this shot, things can go haywire very, very quickly. And I'll sort of show you what I'm talking about. If I take this over into the develop module, and I shut down the history and just come to my presets, if I linearize the image by effectively just adding a process version swap, and then I put the exposure back, yeah. Okay, so we've got red clipping over here. Obviously the highlights are clipped. So if I start to bring the exposure down until that highlight clipping goes away, there we go. So it's sort of 2.5, 2.6 stops. Now if I bring the exposure up, okay, when do I start to get shadow detail coming through? These shadows are still blocked up here. Let's take it all the way up. As you can see, it's just going completely haywire. And a lot of this is down to the camera sensor and the massive amount of underexposure. You can't underexpose shadows by 5 stops. But you know, if you got 5 stops of underexposure in your shadows and 2.5 stops overexposure in your highlights, then you know you're sort of talking 8 stops of dynamic range in the scene, and this sort of camera will not cope with that. You're talking somewhere in the region of what, 500 to 1,000 to 1 contrast ratio in the scene. The contrast ratio is probably actually way worse than that, more like 2,000 to 1. But at the end of the day, there's a moral here. Just don't use micro four thirds cameras in anything less than perfect light. Yes. And try to stay away from really super high contrast scenes. You see, when you look at the image overall, the midtones with this level of exposure compensation, they're only marginally overexposed. Yeah. And of course, it's the midtones where all your detail is. So fundamentally, this image is just massively underexposed, and it's shot on a camera that cannot cope with that level of underexposure. What I will do is I will just go back to a process version swap, and then what can we do? I'll just come to a tone curve here, and I'm going to do something strange. Instead of my usual process version swap, I'm going to put it back to linear, and then I'm just going to lift the black point up a little bit, rather like that. And then I'm going to come and get a micro adjuster, and I'll just put it over the highlight on this young lady's cheek here, and we'll start to lift until we get something akin to what we might find acceptable. Alrighty, now that is just a massive, massive, massive no-no for me. The way this curve is adjusted, it is absolutely shocking. But if I just lift up the black point a little bit more, yeah, we're sort of getting to where we need to be. And then we'll just lift up that point a tad more. I just don't want to increase the level of contrast any more than I have to. The other thing is, obviously, we've got blown highlights in the windows, and we do actually need to just go and put the exposure back to where it should be. And then I'm just going to pull the highlight recovery down, rather like that. And you can see we are sort of back where we started. We'll come up here and we'll look into the noise in these shadows. So we will just go and throw a little bit of noise reduction in there, not much. And we might have to come in and add a little bit more colour noise reduction. And one way we can sort of help with this colour noise reduction down in the shadows is, you can see we've got hints of green. Again, that's a demosaicing on a really massively underexposed image. You can tell we've got no more black clipping, but we've moved the sort of black point quite high up at the minute. So we've got this big gap down here. What I'm going to do is just come into the calibration panel, and I'm just going to get the red primary, and I'm just going to shift it ever so slightly over towards the right, maybe plus 50. And we're starting to warm up these darker shadow areas. Obviously we're warming the rest of the image up, but it's not showing up quite so much as it does in the shadow areas. We now need to start looking at putting a little bit of contrast back in, and so we'll feed a bit of contrast in, and you can see it's sort of going a little bit flat, which is quite strange because you're putting contrast back in. But you have to remember we're working with such a compressed, badly compressed tonal range, where the midtones are down with the shadows, and it just gets somewhat problematic. We can just sort of lift by grabbing here, sort of in the lower midtones on the histogram itself, and nudge the image slightly that way. What else could we do? We've lifted the shadows up quite a bit, so what we'll do is we'll sort of drop them down, and that in effect will drop the contrast in the shadows. Still looking a bit noisy, but don't forget this noise won't print quite as badly as it shows up here. It all depends how big you're going to print the image. We've still got highlight clipping. Where it's clipping, I'm not too sure. I'm going to come in here and look at this white balance. I can't take a white balance off these grey jodhpurs on the backside of this young lady here, because you can't trust that those jodhpurs, if that's what they are actually grey. But we've got this plastic container here, which I'm guessing is a sort of a white plastic container. And what we can do is we can just move the temperature of the image just ever so slightly to the right until that white plastic container begins to go neutral. I'm looking here and I'm looking here. I don't want to look here because this slightly darker grey, because this is semi-transparent, we've obviously got this green cabinet here behind it, so some of the colour will be present in this area here. You've got to look so carefully at things like this when you're trying to adjust an image. But all in all, we're not looking too bad. I'm going to come into the HSL panel, and I'm just going to take the saturation of the yellows down just a little bit. That was the oranges. Just take the saturation of yellows down, because we don't want everything sort of glowing warm. Well, I don't. The actual image that Michael produced was this one. Not really my bag, Michael. It's a bit of an arty effect, which produces quite a few artifacts over here. And, you know, I mean, each to their own. You might like it if that's what floats your boat, then fine, fair enough. And I'm not saying it's wrong. I'm just saying I wouldn't process the image like that, personally speaking, if it was mine. But I can tell you process this in raw therapy, and you've had the lens corrections turned on. So of course, because I'm not working in raw therapy, because I can't follow your exact workflow. But I know you've got Lightroom because you've been doing your soft proofing in Lightroom, so just follow along with me inside of Lightroom for yourself and follow the steps that I've done so far. And what else could we do? We could come back to the basics panel, and what we could do is try and throw a little bit of clarity in there to up the contrast of the midtones. So let's add a little bit of clarity, and that's sort of doing a half decent job there. We need to just bring the highlight clipping down just a little bit more. Let's go and have a look at these shadows again. Yeah, it's still noisy, but you see we're extracting more detail. You can't get away from the fact that it is a very, very noisy image, simply because it's been so massively underexposed. So as we falsely lift the exposure in post, we're actually lifting the appearance of the noise floor. We're increasing the visibility of that poor signal to noise ratio. So what have we done? We've got white balance, we've got exposure done. So what we now have to do is look at the other problem that Michael was having, and that is when it comes to printing this image. Now, if I go to soft proofing and engage soft proofing, if I now go to, that's it, Foamy Jet Portrait Matte 230, and there you go. I mean, it's a very, very washed out, milky looking image, which ordinarily what we might want to do is put a little subtle S-shaped curve on this image just to increase the contrast a little bit, but we can't do that because all we're going to do is just block this roof even more. That's in the relative colorimetric rendering intent. If we switch over to perceptual, it doesn't throw quite as much contrast into the roof as relative colorimetric does. Okay, so the roof looks a little bit better in perceptual. If we just come back to the basics panel and we add a little bit of contrast in there, and yeah, we'll go create proof copy, and then we say we pull a little bit of exposure out. Okay, well, not too much. Maybe add a little bit of dehaze. That's not doing a great deal. What else could we do? We could come in with filters and just put a radial filter over the face of this young lady here, and let's switch that to invert, and we've already got a little bit of exposure dialed in there. Could just brighten her face up just a little bit, but you've got to be careful with what you're doing here because of the massive degree of underexposure. We're going to make this too light and it's going to look sort of out of place in comparison to the darker areas, which are somewhat choked up with detail. But, you know, I mean, to me, this is looking a lot cleaner than Michael's original image, because yes, he's reduced the noise more than I have, but he's blocked the shadows. Everything's a little bit darker, and we've got all these nasty noise reduction plus sharpening artifacts going on within the young lady's face. So, you know, I mean, each to their own. This just depends what you like. But the big problem is, of course, we are trying to put this image onto a piece of paper that just is not capable of rendering this image, because don't forget, the image doesn't look like that, it looks like that. Okay, so if we were to switch out to a nice simple paper like an Epson professional luster photo paper, PLPP, there we go. There's the perceptual rendering intent and there's the relative rendering intent. Not really a lot between them. You'll probably see more of a change in the histogram itself. And there's relative, and there's perceptual. Perceptual just takes the blue part, or the blue channel of the image, down just a little bit further. So, you know, I mean, it's entirely up to personal preference. Is it making a lot of difference in the shadows? Not that I can see, but, you know, we might just want to dial a little bit of exposure back in there and then just pull a little tiny bit of contrast out. All right, maybe a little bit of clarity out, and rather like that. And so this is the way I would process the raw file over in Lightroom. It's the same look overall that I will be trying to get inside of raw therapy, but it's a pointless exercise me doing it in raw therapy and then sending Michael the PP3, because he's on the old public release of 5.8 and he won't be able to read the PP3 file. And I would do it with local adjustments, and of course raw therapy 5.8 public release doesn't have the local adjustments in it. But this is the sort of look I would go for. And just to illustrate to you why this image looks better on this Pro 3800 PLPP paper from Epson, as opposed to the Foamy-Jet, which he was going to get printed at the external print house, is this. It's quite simple. If I pull up my colour sync utility, if I just hold this for comparison, this is the actual Foamy Jet portrait matte colour space. Yeah. So these are all the colours mapped in a three-dimensional space that can be reproduced on Foamy Jet Portrait Matte 230. So if I just hold that for comparison, and then we come to colour spaces, and we come to Pro 3800 PLPP, and there we go. We can now see that this Pro 3800 PLPP paper is the coloured lump, if you like, and the white wireframe is that Foamy Jet Portrait Matte paper. And we can now see that we can reproduce on the Epson Pro Luster paper a lot more of the darker colours in both the reds, the blues and the greens. All right, we are a little bit restricted in the lighter yellow end of the spectrum. White point and black point is pretty much the same. So all in all, we're using a wider gamut paper, a paper with a wider colour gamut, a paper with a bigger colour profile. And so that is why this image looks better on this Pro 4800 PLPP paper than it does on Michael's Foamy Jet paper. It's that mismatch in the profiles between and the picture, and that restrictive colour space of this Foamy Jet portrait paper, and the fact that it's a matte finish. That is why the picture is going milky. So it goes back to a video I put up ages ago where I talk about choosing the right paper for the print job at hand. And so there you go. Now, Michael did ask, how does he go about sending this image out to a printer? Well, ordinarily, what we would do if you got a home-based printer, if you were printing it yourself, you would actually send this virtual copy, softproof copy, straight over to your printer. Well, you can export this by going to File and Export, and you could export this wherever you wanted. You could keep it as a TIFF, and you could keep it in whatever colour space you liked. You could switch it out to Adobe RGB 1998, but then again, you'd have to softproof the image again just to check what it looked like in Adobe RGB 1998. So there we go. And all you need to do is not resize it, just send it out at normal size if that's what you want. Send it out at either 240 or 300 pixels per inch. I wouldn't sharpen it, yeah, and I wouldn't watermark it. Keep all your metadata on if you want, and then no post-processing operation, just leave it wherever it needs to go, and then send it off to the printer, and just treat the print house like you would a desktop printer. But obviously you've got to softproof this image to a profile that printer has. This is why most of us, if we can afford to buy a printer and ink and boxes of paper, this is why we print our own images. Because, you know, you can custom pick a profile that is best suited to the image at hand. And really, this sort of image where it's been massively processed really is very restrictive on what paper profiles you can use to print the finalised image on, fundamentally because it's been pushed just so much. Anyway, Michael, hope that goes a bit of a way to answering your question, solving your problem. Sorry we couldn't do this in raw therapy. using your PP3 that you originally created. And as I said before, I can't actually read that PP3, and any PP3 that I create, I can't send to you because there's nothing you can do with it. So there we go. All right, guys and girls. Everybody should have learnt something, a little nugget of something from that video. Hope you have. And so until the next time, guys and girls, stay safe, stay well, keep taking the pictures, and I'll see you very soon. Tooroo.